times. You caught all this. But there's two new disclosure requirements. One is called a reasonable actuarial determined contribution, and they, of course, actual standards of practice define what reasonable would mean. And then a low default risk obligation measure. These are two items. They do not change the funding requirements or anything like that. They're just two new numbers that we do need to talk about in the VAL report, and we did. One is a reasonable actually determined contribution, and I have some stuff here kind of that's what's telling us how to choose what that would be. Basically, there's a lot of pressure to say we don't want to use negative amortization. You need to be in a position where enough contributions coming in that at least the unfunded liability is not growing, and preferably would begin the process of coming down. Your board policy fits right with that, right? It's just if we ever look out 5 years and the unfunded liability is not expected to begin declining, then we request enough that it does begin to decline. That fits right into that reasonable actually determined contribution definition, and so that's the one that we used. We went ahead and published that in the report of what that would be under the board's policy, so it's consistent. So that's not a big surprise. Again, it doesn't mean that the state has to fund to that. It just is a disclosure requirement we have to put in there. And that was really a reaction to situations, well, like we've had here in the past, where there was years where it was clear by reading the report that something needed to be done. Well, the standards now say, you know what, it's not enough to just say something needs to be done. You need to give them an answer that is something that they need to do. You know, so you can't just say, hey, we don't think this is funding appropriately. You need to do something. You need to say this is not being funded appropriately, and here's an option. So it's a much more affirmative stance. And finally,
So Joe, where do we find ourselves right now in terms of how many more years will we be in a negative amortization scenario before we start?
9.
9 more years.
So we're past the 5. Your original strategy did say we'll kind of get past this phase-in period of the contribution rates before we start really thinking about it. But that would be next year. So I think it is time to really at least look at that and see what the implications would be and start that discussion. Because again, if it's 9 before it even starts coming down, well, again, we're no guaranteed to get 7%. What if you get 6.8? Well, now it's 12 before it starts going down, or 15. Like when we're out at this high, it really starts to expand quickly on us, and we don't want to. I mean, you guys remember,
right?
We had years that went from fully funded to infinite to 2 to infinite, like back to back to back to back.
The whole asymptotic curve problem.
So. And we do, again, I'm going to come back, I think we're going to do another education session at another date, just really focusing on this item, not necessarily the reasonable actually determined contribution, but just how our plan's funding, like what are some different funding strategies being used, what are the pros and cons, and begin some of those discussions. The final one is a low default risk obligation measure. And the reason that that word doesn't ring a bell is because it's new. like literally the term is a new thing they made up to try to describe something that's really been a discussion for a long time. So if you've been to any sort of national conferences or anything for a long time, there's been discussion of the market value of liability discussions. Should you be valuing your liabilities using bond yields instead of the expected return, those kinds of discussions. Well, this is kind of where the community ended up in that debate or negotiation, we'll call it. And it basically says do everything else the same. It's not a termination liability because we continue to assume people earn new benefits and salary increases and those kinds of things. But what if the decision was made to begin to invest in very low default securities, basically a bond portfolio, instead of taking equity risk? What would that look like to the liabilities of the pension fund? And so as of August 31st, the FTSE Pension Index, which is an index that's published based on a lot of private sector plans who do actually invest almost all in bonds. Well, what do those portfolios look like? And that's what we used here. And it was about a 5.15% yield that could have been used. And so if we had to determine the accrued liability on that basis, you can see here, it's about almost a $70 billion difference in that liability. So it's substantial. So there's a few things that number is telling you. One, that's how much equity premium that needs to be collected in the future to kind of make the 7% work. That's one side of it. I think a more practical side of what could be actionable at some point is it's also the cost to de-risk. So if the state decided, I don't want to have investment at risk anymore, okay, well, they could go to this kind of portfolio, they would need to give you a lump sum of $70 billion to make up that difference. So it's kind of like a, you know, a put option, right? If you go into the market, you buy a put option where you pay a premium for that and you get the protection. So you can almost see like the 70 billion looks something like that premium. Right now, it's probably too big. It doesn't make a lot of sense. However, what if it was 10 billion? Like, is there some point when the state would start to say, you know, this risk, maybe this premium's worth it? Or you could split it up and say, well, what about just for retirees? What if to totally immunize just your retirees cost you $4 billion? And you could say, hey, that whole part of my liability now, I don't have to worry about anymore. And in fact, from a cash flow perspective, I don't have to worry about cash flow for the next 20 years. How can I invest the rest of the pool, right? So I think there might be some discussions that could come from that information at different points in time. Now, do I think either of those are strong enough that it should have been required to be in every report always for everyone? I don't know. You know, that's a pretty big hurdle, but it is there. I do all think a negative of it is even if you wanted to react, I mean, it's 4 months ago. You know, the 515 is not 515 anymore. Like, it's, you know, you'd have to really be on your toes and looking at this unless interest rates just stay high. But anyway, it is a number. It's in the report. It's disclosed. Nothing to be scared of. It's just a way to look at the liability if you tried to make your liabilities based on assets that look similar, which is very low default, right? Your retirees expect to get their annuities. They don't expect the state to not pay them. So if you chose that from an asset perspective, about 515 would be the assumed rate of return, essentially. Any questions on that number? I just didn't want to not present it to you, and then you read a report or someone asks you about it, and you're like, what? There's a new number that's 70 billion higher? Or, you know, it's
every report has to have this in it.
every report for every plan now has this in it.
You're saying 70 billion?
70 billion, right? 69.9, yeah, 69. We put it in millions so that
Okay.
someone had to be smart enough to figure out that's billion.
Yeah, all right, I was
But
like, what
yeah,
are you?
it is. And this is where your age actually puts you at a little bit of a disadvantage in this delta because you're so young. You know, if you think about it, for a 70-year-old, whether they're going to earn 7 going forward or 6, there's not a lot of time for that to be much different. So the liability's not much different. But for a 30-year-old, you got 50 years of projection. That's huge, right? Well, you're very young because you just grow so much. So we always have a lot of 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds in the plan. And so that's why any time you start moving that discount rate, it really impacts you. And this is one of those times. So in summary,